Why you should question the Trinity, Colossians 1:15. Is Jesus a creature, the literal firstborn of all creation?
Before the mountains rose, before the morning stars applauded at creation's sight, Jehovah brought forth an only begotten Son, his firstborn in whom he delighted. Michael, wisdom, Jesus, the Word divine, the firstborn of all creation, first in rank and time. Through this firstborn, truly all else came to be, by Jehovah's will and great power, for all of eternity.
Colossians 1:15 is one of the most discussed verses about Christ's identity. Paul writes, the he here, being Jesus, is the firstborn of all creation. At first glance, that sounds straightforward, but what does it really mean in the original language? To answer that, we'll look at the words, the grammar, the examples, and then see what leading Greek scholars have said. Finally, we'll draw a clear conclusion based on evidence, not tradition, emotion, or mere assumptions. The phrase in Greek is prototokos pases ktiseos, which literally means firstborn of all creation. Here, firstborn refers to the first in birth, order, and rank, while at creation, here, ktiseos, which stems from ktisis, means something that has been created or brought into existence by God. This term is never applied to the Almighty himself, who is uncreated and unbegotten. So, right away, Paul is connecting Jesus to the created order, not to God's own uncreated nature. Now, here's where the grammar is critical. The phrase of all creation uses the genitive case in Greek, which shows a relationship between two words. The genitive can mean different things. A few examples are possessive, the house of Peter. Peter owns the house. Objective, the love of God. Love directed toward God. Partitive, one of the men. Someone who belongs to the group of men. However, the question is, which one applies here? Well, it is no surprise that some Trinitarians argue that the verse should be translated firstborn over all creation, as if Jesus rules outside of creation. But, of course, that would require an objective genitive or genitive of subordination. And let me tell you, there's a huge problem with that. For instance, an objective genitive only works when the main noun is verbal, meaning it involves an action. For example, love can act, so love of God works. But of course, firstborn here is not a verb or an action. Rather, it's a descriptive noun. It shows position, order, or rank, not something being done. So, because firstborn is not verbal, the genitive here cannot be objective. That interpretation is grammatically impossible, which means firstborn over all creation is not an honest, proper translation or interpretation. Of course, this leaves us with just a few, or perhaps one other option, the partitive genitive, which, as noted previously, implies that Jesus himself is part of the group called creation, but is the first and the most prominent creature within that group. This isn't just a theory, for we see the same construction of partitive genitive in other verses as well. For instance, in Revelation 1:5, where it calls Jesus the firstborn from the dead, the genitive here is of the dead, a member of a group, while the partitive indicates that Jesus was one among the dead, but was the literal first to be resurrected to immortal life in both order and rank. Another example is Romans 8:29, where Jesus is called the firstborn among many brothers, showing that Jesus is within the group of anointed brothers, but was the very first to be anointed, and is held in the highest rank among them. Thus, the pattern of firstborn and partitive genitive that means belonging to the same class or group of persons, but is the first in origin and preeminence among them. This therefore leads us to an important question. What do respected Greek scholars and grammarians have to say about Colossians 1:15? Well, Daniel B. Wallace says, the genitive in Colossians 1:15 is clearly partitive. The head noun, firstborn, is not verbal in nature and thus cannot take an objective genitive. The phrase must mean that Christ is the firstborn as part of creation. Another example is the scholar named A.T. Robertson, who stated, the genitive is partitive. Christ is regarded as the first of the created things. Also, there's Lightfoot, who stated in their writings, the genitive is clearly partitive. The firstborn is included in the class of created things, but is first in rank. Furthermore, James H. Charlesworth, in the Old Testament pseudepigrapha, had explained that the consistent partitive use for prototokos, firstborn, in Greek texts, always indicate that something is first within a group and never inherently rulership. This, of course, cancels out the genitive of subordination as well. Thus, in conclusion, many scholars, or at least those whom aren't theologically biased or dishonest, all collectively agree that the grammar allows for only one meaning, That, the Apostle Paul is saying that Jesus is part of creation, that he is both the literal firstborn of creation and the highest in rank. Of course, in ancient Hebrew culture, the firstborn son had a special status. The literal firstborn was priority in time or was literally born first, and supremacy in position. The firstborn law was not just a cultural custom, it was a representation of a heavenly reality. That is, the Mosaic law contained many patterns that foreshadowed greater spiritual and heavenly truths. Here's how this applies. As stated in Hebrews 8:5, the law was a shadow of the heavenly things. This, of course, means that the earthly system mirrored a higher spiritual reality. In that, the firstborn regulation, as mentioned in Deuteronomy 21:17, had granted the literal firstborn son honor and a double portion, which was a shadow pointing to the pre-human Christ, or Michael, as the literal firstborn son and the beginning of Jehovah's procreative power. So, when the Bible calls Jesus the firstborn of all creation, it implies that he was the beginning of Jehovah's procreative power, the first to be brought into existence by God, and the one who's legally held in the highest rank among all of creation. Thus, in heaven, the true reality is that the pre-human Christ is indeed the literal firstborn of all creation, and therefore is the heir of all things, as mentioned in Hebrews 1:2, which the firstborn law represented and anticipated. So, in closing, just as the firstborn in Israel received preeminence and inheritance, the pre-human Christ, or Michael, inherits all, both the heavenly and earthly domain, just as the law foreshadowed. And since Jehovah had established a moral principle in his law, such as the honor, preeminence, and inheritance being given to the literal firstborn, then he himself would also act in harmony with the firstborn principle and not in contradiction to it.